They moved through the crowd, small shapes against a wider world, their steps quiet and measured. The voices around them rose and fell, a tide of chatter that seemed endless. Yet they said nothing, not because they had nothing to say, but because words felt heavy in their hands and the world seemed too loud to listen anyway. Have you ever felt that way when every sound presses against your chest and you just want to breathe in silence instead? They walked slowly, letting their eyes take in what others rushed past, the color of the stones beneath their feet, the way the wind touched the leaves, the soft curve of a shadow stretching across the ground. These were small things, unnoticed by most, yet they held a kind of weight that the noise could never reach. And in that noticing, in that quiet attention, there was a strange kind of company. Even when they were alone, they were not lonely. The world continued to move, impatient and restless, but they did not need to keep pace. They paused at the edge of the road, letting the moment settle around them like a thin mist. How easily we forget the silence that lives between one heartbeat and the next, they thought. How easily we overlook the spaces where nothing is asked and nothing is demanded. Yet here, in these spaces, there is a kind of listening that can touch deeper than any words. Sometimes a glance would meet theirs from the crowd. A passing shadow of curiosity or perhaps annoyance, but they did not respond. Why should they? The eyes of others did not understand what was held quietly inside. There was a rhythm to restraint, a patience that felt like a river running beneath the surface. And they let it flow, steady and calm, even when it went unnoticed. They could feel the stirrings of questions inside them, small, restless questions that wanted to spill out into the world. Why does no one see? Why does no one pause? And then, almost gently, they reminded themselves that it was not the world's duty to notice. Perhaps their silence was not a refusal, but a way of being. Perhaps the watching itself was enough. There is a strange courage in that, a courage that does not shout or demand attention but simply exists. As they walked, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, not because it had stopped, but because their mind had learned to move differently. They were not deaf, not blind, but their spirit had learned a kind of listening that goes beneath sound. How easily we mistake motion for meaning and voices for wisdom. But here, in quiet, there was a kind of understanding that no words could reach. They felt it, subtle and soft, like a breath that touches the surface of a calm pond. And yet, there was a loneliness to it too. Not sharp or bitter, but gentle, like a shadow that follows even in the light. Sometimes they wondered if anyone else could feel the same, if anyone else could stand still while the world spun so quickly. But the thought was brief, and they let it go, returning to the rhythm of noticing, of feeling, of holding something quietly that no one else could take. A small bird landed near their feet. It tilted its head as if curious about the quiet figure watching without speaking. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The air held its breath, and they felt a flicker of connection, a soft reassurance that silence was not emptiness. Even the smallest witness, even the tiniest presence, could acknowledge the quiet without needing words. They continued on, step by careful step, carrying their stillness like a gentle cloak. The crowd moved around them, waves of sound and motion, yet they remained steady, undisturbed. In this quiet they began to understand something they had not known before, that silence is not the absence of life, but a way of touching it more deeply. That by not speaking, by not reacting, one can see and feel more than anyone who shouts ever could. And as the sun dipped low, painting the edges of the sky with soft gold, they felt a small peace settle inside. It was not loud, not urgent, not full of triumph. It was simple, like the slow turning of a leaf in the wind. Here, in this quiet, in this gentle noticing of the world and of themselves, they were fully present, fully alive. And they carried that quiet, delicate strength with every Step they took, even as the crowd moved on, never quite noticing the stillness that walked among them. They stood at the edge of the path, feeling the weight of what they had seen. The world moved on around them, unaware, but inside a quiet unrest had begun to grow. It was not anger, not fear, but a subtle ache that settled deep in the chest, soft and persistent. Have you ever felt something stir inside you that you could not speak aloud, something that watches, waits, and quietly questions the world? They had seen so much, small moments that passed without notice. A stumble, a frown, a hurried word said too sharply, each one pressed lightly against their mind like a shadow brushing across the floor. Yet they held it in. There was no one to tell, no ears ready to understand. And so the ache became a companion, a quiet presence that reminded them of all that moved too quickly to be noticed. Sometimes they would sit beneath a tree, letting the wind touch their face, listening to the rustle of leaves. In those moments, the questions would rise again. Why do we hurt each other so easily? Why do we speak before we see? And yet, even as the questions came, there was a knowing that nothing could be hurried, that understanding takes time, like water slowly filling a hidden stream. Patience is the only answer, though it whispers softly, almost too quietly to hear. They watched others in passing, unaware of the quiet figure observing. A harsh word thrown carelessly, a glance that cut deeper than intended, the small cruelties that slip between words and gestures, and still they remained silent. Not because they were afraid, but because they felt the weight of speaking. Sometimes a word spoken too soon can fracture what might have been understood. And so they waited, holding back, letting the stillness gather around them like a protective cloak. Inside, the ache grew sharper, yet it did not demand release. It was a heavy kind of watching, a deep attentiveness to the world and to themselves. Each incident they observed left a small mark, a quiet note in a long, unseen melody. They felt the stirrings of sorrow, a tender sadness for the way the world moved so carelessly. And yet, even sorrow was tempered by a gentle acceptance. They could not change the world in a single breath, but they could carry the weight of it quietly, and perhaps let it shape them from within. They noticed the small details that others overlooked, the tremble in a hand, the hesitation in a glance, the silence after harsh words had been spoken. These were the truths that no one else seemed to see, the soft realities hidden beneath noise, and each observation sank into them, like seeds planted in quiet soil. What will grow from these seeds, they wondered. Only time could tell, and only silence could nurture them. There was a longing, too, a desire for understanding, for someone to meet their quiet gaze and see the weight they carried. But the longing was gentle, almost shy. And T did not demand fulfillment. It existed like a small flame, flickering softly in the shadow of the larger world, and they allowed it to be, without forcing it, without expecting it to change the tides of what they saw, and so they walked on, carrying the ache with them like a hidden lantern. Each step was careful, measured, yet filled with a quiet power that no one else noticed. They did not speak of the things they observed. Words could not capture the depth of feeling, the subtle shifts of thought, the quiet sorrow of watching without interfering. But still they felt it all, deeply, entirely, as if each unseen moment added to a hidden strength within. Sometimes the wind would change, and a soft sound would carry through the trees. A bird's call, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of water. In these moments they would pause and listen, letting the ache ease for a moment, letting the world offer a small kindness in return. And they would remember that this watching, this quiet presence, was not emptiness. It was a way of being, a way of holding what is unseen and letting it shape the heart with gentle, persistent care. And as the day drew on, shadows lengthening across the path, they felt a strange clarity settle within. The weight remained, but it no longer pressed against them harshly. It was a companion now, a reminder of what they had seen, what they had felt, and what they chose to carry quietly. in the watching, in the feeling, in the silence. They were learning something that could not be spoken aloud, that the heart can bear much, that patience is a kind of wisdom, and that sometimes the deepest understanding comes not from words, but from quiet attention and gentle endurance. They could feel the weight of the world's eyes, though no one had looked directly at them. A glance here, a whisper there, and still they stood quietly, carrying something that no one seemed to understand. It is a strange thing to be seen but not known, to move through the world and yet feel invisible in the ways that matter most. Have you ever been looked at and yet entirely unseen, as if the world could not reach the quiet that lives inside you? They had grown accustomed to it, this subtle misunderstanding, but it did not make the ache any lighter. Sometimes a voice would rise sharply, questioning something they had done or had not done, and they would feel the pulse of judgment, sharp and sudden, though unspoken. And still, they did not answer. Not because they did not feel it, but because they knew that silence could carry its own meaning, heavier and truer than words spoken too soon. It was not always easy. They felt the stirrings of frustration, of a longing to be recognized, to have someone meet the quiet they offered with understanding. Yet they held it back. Why is it so hard for others to see what lies beneath? Why does the world prefer noise to stillness? And then, in the pause, a softer thought would rise, almost like a breath, perhaps. It is not theirs to change, not theirs to fix. Perhaps the unseen strength of silence is enough, even if it is misunderstood. They observed how quickly others moved to conclusions, how lightly a glance could become judgment, how easily misunderstanding could take root. Each misread gesture, each misheard thought pressed lightly against their heart, and yet they did not recoil, did not strike back. They let the misunderstanding pass over them, like wind over a still pond, leaving only the ripple of thought behind. How strange it is, they thought, that so often the world mistakes quiet for weakness, patience for indifference, restraint for surrender. And there was sorrow in this too, a soft, tender sorrow for the way others failed to see, for the way small gestures and careful attention went unnoticed. They remembered the moments when they had tried to speak, when they had tried to explain, only to find their words falling like dry leaves, unheeded, misunderstood. And so, over time, they learned the delicate art of stillness, the careful keeping of their own truth, no matter how lightly it was received. They noticed, too, the strange beauty of being misunderstood. It was painful, yes, but it also allowed them to move more deeply into themselves, to touch corners of thought and feeling that no one else could reach. In the quiet that followed misreading, they discovered a freedom of sorts, a space where the world's judgments could not reach. And in that space, a kind of strength began to grow, soft and unassuming, yet unshakable. Sometimes the world would seem harsh, pressing with its eyes and whispers, and they would feel a small tremor of anger, a flare of sharpness that threatened to rise. But then they would breathe, slowly, and notice the ground beneath their feet, the wind that brushed past their face, the quiet rhythm of their own heartbeat. And in that noticing, the flare would pass, leaving only a calm awareness that their truth did not need permission to exist. They realized slowly that being misunderstood was not a punishment nor a failing, but a mirror. It showed them the depth of their own quiet courage, the patience of their restraint, and the resilience of their own heart. How easy it is to confuse noise for wisdom, how often the world mistakes sound for understanding. And yet, in the stillness, they could feel the steady pulse of something stronger, something unseen yet real, like roots growing deep beneath the earth, holding them steady when everything above shifts and bends. And so they walked, carrying both the sorrow and the strange gift of being misunderstood. The world continued to move around them, quick and unfeeling, but they moved differently, slowly, softly, deliberately, letting each step mark the rhythm of their own heart, not the pace of others' expectations. They did not need to be known to be present. They did not need agreement to hold their own truth, and in that quiet acceptance, they discovered something rare, a sense of self that could not be shaken even when the eyes of the world were blind to it. By the time the shadows stretched long across the ground, they had come to understand that the ache of being misunderstood could become a teacher. It could show them patience, resilience, and the soft courage of restraint. And even in the midst of quiet sorrow, even in the weight of unseen eyes, they felt a strange comfort, a gentle assurance that the heart can be whole, even when it is alone, even when it is silently carrying the depth of its own quiet truths. In the quiet that followed, they began to feel something new stirring inside. It was not loud, not sudden, but a subtle unfolding, like the first light of dawn brushing the horizon. They had carried so much weight, seen so much that others ignored, yet here in the stillness, they felt a gentle clarity. Have you ever noticed how the world seems to slow when you stop trying to keep pace, how the noise begins to fade and leaves only the soft truths beneath? They sat beneath the branches of an old tree, its leaves trembling softly in the breeze. Each rustle seemed to speak a language they had almost forgotten, a language of patience, of quiet seeing. They breathed in slowly, letting the air settle inside, feeling the rhythm of their own heartbeat. And in that rhythm, a thought emerged, delicate and tentative. Perhaps everything they had carried so far was not a burden, but a kind of guide. For a long time they had felt restless, a tension beneath their ribs, a need to act, to respond, to be understood. And yet, in the silence, that tension began to soften. What if the answer had never been in reaction, they wondered? What if the deepest truths are revealed not in speaking or acting, but in simply noticing, in allowing space for the world to move as it does, without interference? They looked at the ground, at the patterns of light and shadow beneath the tree, and felt a small shift within themselves. There was a calmness there that had been absent before, a gentle settling, as though some hidden corner of their mind had finally been given permission to rest. How strange it is, they thought, that the world's rushing can hide what has always been present, that only in stillness do we see clearly what has been with us all along. It came to them that their silence had never been emptiness. It had been a kind of listening, a quiet learning of the world and of themselves. Each observation, each unspoken thought, each moment of restraint had been part of a slow awakening, and now, sitting beneath the tree, they began to understand what it had all been for. Perhaps the world's misunderstanding, the noise, the restless crowd, perhaps all of it had led them here, to this soft clarity. They noticed how small details became larger in the stillness. A bird landing near the water, a leaf drifting slowly on the breeze, the subtle play of light on the stones. Each one held a kind of meaning, not urgent, no, demanding, but steady and true. And they realized that these small things, these quiet observations, were teaching them something about themselves, about what it meant to hold calm in a world that rushes without pause. A thought arose, fragile as a whisper. The world cannot always understand, and perhaps it should not. For understanding is not always immediate, and some truths take their time. Some strengths take their time to grow. And as they felt that thought settle, they noticed a faint smile, a quiet easing of the tension that had clung to their shoulders. This was the gentle power of seeing, of feeling, of understanding without the need for others' permission. They thought of the times they had felt restless, the moments when frustration had pressed at their chest, and now, they understood that the restlessness had been a teacher, showing them where patience might be needed, where silence might carry more than words ever could. How strange and gentle it is, they reflected, that the things we most resist often contain the lessons we most need if we only pause long enough to listen. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of earth and leaves, and they closed their eyes for a moment, letting it wash over them. In the quiet, they felt something like relief, but not a loud relief, something soft, like a river smoothing stones over time. They felt the tension of judgment, of expectation, even of misunderstanding, begin to soften, and with it came a gentle courage, a quiet assurance that they could remain still and still be whole, that clarity could live inside without the need for anyone else to see it. And as the shadows grew longer, stretching over the ground in gentle lines, they realized that this moment, this quiet unfolding of understanding, was not an end but a beginning of seeing, of feeling, of holding themselves softly yet firmly in a world that would not always understand. And in that quiet realization they felt a calm rising, a steady, patient strength, born not of action or reaction, but of deep, gentle noticing, of learning to trust the stillness that lives inside. In the quiet that followed, they began to feel something new stirring inside. It was not loud, not sudden, but a subtle unfolding, like the first light of dawn brushing the horizon. They had carried so much weight, seen so much that others ignored, yet here in the stillness they felt a gentle clarity. Have you ever noticed how the world seems to slow when you stop trying to keep pace, how the noise begins to fade and leaves only the soft truths beneath? They sat beneath the branches of an old tree, its leaves trembling softly in the breeze. Each rustle seemed to speak a language they had almost forgotten, a language of patience, of quiet seeing. They breathed in slowly, letting the air settle inside, feeling the rhythm of their own heartbeat, and in that rhythm a thought emerged, delicate and tentative. Perhaps everything they had carried so far was not a burden, but a kind of guide. For a long time they had felt restless, a tension beneath their ribs, a need to act, to respond, to be understood. And yet, in the silence, that tension began to soften. What if the answer had never been in reaction, they wondered? What if the deepest truths are revealed not in speaking or acting, but in simply noticing, in allowing space for the world to move as it does, without interference? They looked at the ground, at the patterns of light and shadow beneath the tree, and felt a small shift within themselves. There was a calmness there that had been absent before, a gentle settling, as though some hidden corner of their mind had finally been given permission to rest. How strange it is, they thought, that the world's rushing can hide what has always been present, that only in stillness do we see clearly what has been with us all along. It came to them that their silence had never been emptiness. It had been a kind of listening, a quiet learning of the world and of themselves. Each observation, each unspoken thought, each moment of restraint had been part of a slow awakening, and now, sitting beneath the tree, they began to understand what it had all been for. Perhaps the world's misunderstanding, the noise, the restless crowd, perhaps all of it had led them here to this soft clarity. They noticed how small details became larger in the stillness. A bird landing near the water, a leaf drifting slowly on the breeze, the subtle play of light on the stones. Each one held a kind of meaning, not urgent, not demanding, but steady and true. And they realized that these small things, these quiet observations, were teaching them something about themselves, about what it meant to hold calm in a world that rushes without pause. A thought arose, fragile as a whisper. The world cannot always understand, and perhaps it should not. For understanding is not always immediate, and some truths take their time, some strengths take their time to grow, and as they felt that thought settle, they noticed a faint smile, a quiet easing of the tension that had clung to their shoulders. This was the gentle power of seeing, of feeling, of understanding without the need for others' permission. They thought of the times they had felt restless, the moments when frustration had pressed at their chest. And now they understood that the restlessness had been a teacher, showing them where patience might be needed, where silence might carry more than words ever could. How strange and gentle it is, they reflected, that the things we most resist often contain the lessons we most need if we only pause long enough to listen The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of earth and leaves, and they closed their eyes for a moment, letting it wash over them. In the quiet, they felt something like relief, but not a loud relief, something soft, like a river smoothing stones over time. They felt the tension of judgment, of expectation, even of misunderstanding begin to soften, and with it came a gentle courage, a quiet assurance that they could remain still and still be whole, that clarity could live inside without the need for anyone else to see it. And as the shadows grew longer, stretching over the ground in gentle lines, they realized that this moment, this quiet unfolding of understanding, was not an end, but a beginning of seeing, of feeling, of holding themselves softly yet firmly in a world that would not always understand. And in that quiet realization they felt a calm rising, a steady, patient strength, born not of action or reaction, but of deep, gentle noticing, of learning to trust the stillness that lives inside. They felt the quiet strength settle in their chest, a warmth that had been building slowly, almost imperceptibly, through the days of watching, listening, and waiting. It was not a loud power, not a power that demanded notice or applause. It was softer than that, a steady presence like the slow, certain rise of the tide beneath the moon. And for the first time they understood that this strength had been growing all along, nurtured by every choice to remain still when the world pushed to provoke a reaction. It was strange to feel power in silence, to feel it not in the movement of their hands or the sharpness of their words, but in the calm that now lived within. They had known the temptation to speak, to respond, to defend the quiet truth they carried. Yet in holding back, they discovered something the world could not take from them. The choice to remain silent, to wait, to observe, had become an act of quiet courage. Have you ever felt that? The sensation that by saying nothing, by reacting to nothing, you are stronger than if you had spoken 100 times? They felt it now, not as a thought, but as a living pulse. Each heartbeat seemed to affirm it, steady and unwavering. What is strength, they wondered, if not the ability to remain whole in the face of misunderstanding, to hold one's own truth without demanding the world bend to it? They noticed how differently the world began to move around them when they carried this quiet power. Not that others suddenly understood or saw them more clearly, but that the weight of expectation no longer pressed as heavily. Their eyes were not looking for permission. Their thoughts were not waiting for approval. And in that freedom, they felt the soft unspoken proof of what restraint could yield, a strength unshakable because it had grown from within. It had taken patience to reach this point, patience that had been learned slowly, almost painfully. Each moment they did not react. Each time they held their tongue or softened a glance, they had added a small stone to an invisible foundation beneath their feet. And now, standing quietly among the noise and the hurry of the world, they could feel the solidness of it, the subtle, unyielding presence of a self built not on what others demanded, but on what the why had nurtured themselves. The moments of temptation had not been few. At times, the desire to shout, to explain, to correct the world had pressed like a storm at their chest. And yet, each time, they had chosen differently. Each time, they had breathed, felt the ground beneath their feet, and allowed the pause to hold them. And with every pause, the quiet strength inside had grown a little more, until it was no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but steady and enduring. They realized with a gentle amazement that not reacting was not a surrender, as the world might suggest. It was, instead, an act of creation. By refusing to let anger, fear, or misunderstanding dictate their response, they were shaping themselves moment by moment into someone who could walk calmly through the storm without losing the center of who they were. How often do we mistake motion for power, they thought, not noticing that stillness can be the deepest form of courage. And in this understanding, a new softness entered their awareness. They felt no need for recognition, no hunger for acknowledgement. The world might misjudge, misunderstand, or even ignore them entirely. And yet, the quiet power they carried needed none of these things to exist. It was a strength held silently, a warmth that belonged to no one but themselves, yet touched everything they did, everything they saw. Sometimes in the gentle sway of a breeze, in the subtle turning of light across the earth, they felt the quiet echo of this strength reaching outward, not in a way that demanded attention, but as a subtle influence, a ripple through the world, felt only by those who paused long enough to notice. And they understood, finally, that real power does not announce itself. It does not push or strike. It moves quietly, steadily, like water carving stone over time, shaping the world not by noise but by patience, not by force but by calm persistence. As the sun shifted, softening the edges of the day, they carried this realization with them. They did not need to prove it, did not need to display it, and did not need the world to understand. The quiet strength of not reacting, of holding one's own truth softly but firmly, had become a part of them, unshakable, enduring, and deeply alive. And in that stillness, in that gentle acceptance of what they had learned through patience and restraint, they felt a peace that was neither loud nor fleeting, but steady, soft, and quietly profound. They began to notice the subtle shifts around them, the small, almost invisible changes that took place when they remained quiet and steady. The world continued its noisy rhythm, yet there were moments when its edges softened, when harshness seemed to bend slightly, when a glance carried less weight, and a word was measured more carefully. Could it be that their stillness had left a trace, a gentle ripple, in ways too small for others to name? It was never loud or obvious. No one applauded, no one remarked upon it, and yet they could feel it in the air, a quiet unfolding, as if the calm they carried had touched something else, something hidden, waiting to notice. They realized that influence does not always demand attention, that change can move softly, imperceptibly, like the way a shadow lengthens as the sun sinks lower. Sometimes they would see the faintest easing of tension in others' faces, a pause before a sharp word, a hesitation where once there had been a rush to judgment. It was so small that they could almost doubt it, but they knew in their heart that it was there. How strange, they thought, that the world can shift not through force, but through quiet presence, not through noise, but through the gentle weight of calm. They remembered the days when they had felt restless, when the urge to speak, to correct, to act had been nearly irresistible. And now, looking back, they could see how each moment of restraint had carried a hidden gift. Each choice to remain silent, to hold still, had become a seed planted in the soil of the world. And though they could not see the full tree yet, they could sense the roots spreading beneath the surface, unseen but strong. It was not always easy to notice. Often the world moved too fast, the noise too loud for subtle ripples to be felt clearly. But in the moments when the wind softened, when light shifted gently, when a pause stretched just long enough for attention to rest, they could see the quiet power of restraint. They began to understand. And that patience, observed over time, could create change in ways words never could. And with that understanding came a new softness, a gentle humility. They did not need to force the world to bend, nor did they need to assert themselves to be heard. The quiet influence of their presence was enough, moving slowly through the spaces others overlooked, shaping the edges of thought and feeling in subtle, tender ways. It was a power not of command but of being, a strength that whispered rather than shouted. They thought of how often they had been misunderstood, how frequently their silence had been mistaken for weakness. And yet, now, they saw that the same silence that had once seemed like a burden had become a kind of quiet authority, an invisible guide. Could it be that the things we most fear, our stillness, our restraint, our quiet patience, are the very things that shape the world in ways we cannot measure? As the day stretched on, they began to notice the soft echoes of their choices. A gesture softened, a glance lingered, a word was unspoken and left peace in its place. It was as though the world itself recognized in some subtle way the calm they carried. And in that recognition, quiet as it was, they felt a sense of fulfillment, not loud or triumphant, but gentle, like the slow settling of leaves at the edge of a stream. They realized that influence need not be visible to exist. It need not be acknowledged to be real. Each unspoken word, each quiet breath, each steady heartbeat left a trace, small and delicate, but enough to touch, enough to shape, enough to remind them that the strength of restraint is not in its show, but in its subtle persistence, in the quiet power of being fully present without needing recognition. And as the sun began its descent, casting long, soft shadows over the ground, they walked slowly, feeling the gentle weight of this unseen ripple around them. It was a quiet triumph, a tender proof that patience and composure can reach farther than noise and haste, that calm can move through the world invisibly, softly changing what it touches, leaving something enduring in its wake. And in that quiet understanding, they felt a soft, steady warmth, a gentle affirmation that growth can be slow, invisible, yet profoundly real, like roots reaching deep beneath the earth to hold a tree firmly. Even when the wind blows hard, they realized slowly that their restraint had never been weakness. For so long they had thought that silence was a kind of absence, that not reacting meant giving up, that holding back was somehow less than. And yet, in the quiet that had grown inside them, they could feel the truth of it. Restraint was a strength, subtle and steady, rooted in patience, self-respect, and understanding. How strange, they thought, that the world often mistakes action for power, when true power can live in stillness. They had carried many moments of tension, many times when the world's push seemed almost unbearable. The temptation to respond, to argue, to make themselves known had been strong. And yet, in every choice to remain calm, to let words pass like wind over water, they had discovered a deeper kind of courage. Not the courage that is loud or sudden, but the courage that grows slowly, quietly, beneath the surface, unseen but unshakable. Sometimes they looked back at the days when they had felt misunderstood, when the world had pressed on them with judgment and expectation, and they saw now that those moments had been necessary. They had taught patience, they had shaped a quiet authority that could not be taken by others. How often does the world mistake noise for knowledge, words for wisdom, reaction for strength? And yet, here in the calm, they could feel the unspoken truth. Power does not always need to announce itself. They noticed how gentle this strength felt, like a river moving beneath the ground, carrying life without being seen. It did not demand recognition. It did not boast or press. It simply existed, quietly steady, and in its steadiness it touched everything around it. They could feel it in themselves, in the soft rise and fall of breath, in the careful patience of their thoughts, in the subtle warmth that had grown in their chest. It was not loud. It did not clamor for attention, but it was real, enduring, and true. They thought about the moments when anger had pressed close, when frustration had bubbled like a storm within, when they had longed to strike back or to speak harshly. And now they understood that it was precisely in resisting those urges that they had discovered this strength. Every time they paused, every time they let words remain unspoken, every time they chose calm over reaction, they had added another layer to a quiet fortress within themselves. And in that fortress, they found a kind of safety, a kind of peace, a kind of power that no one could take from them. It was not an easy realization, and it had taken time. The world does not always recognize the quiet, does not always understand the patience it takes to remain still when the current pulls hard, but the quiet knows, the heart knows, and in that knowing they felt something soft but certain. Self-respect is not given by others, it is built from within. It grows from restraint, from thoughtful presence, from the careful tending of one's own inner life. They thought of the small moments that had once seemed insignificant, The choice to step back instead of stepping in, to listen instead of answering, to wait instead of forcing. Those moments now gathered together in memory shone with a quiet brilliance. Each one had been a small act of courage, an assertion of self that needed no audience, no approval, no recognition, and together they had built something strong, something subtle, something enduring. And so I walked, carrying this realization with them as easily as breath. The world continued to move around them, restless and loud, yet they remained centered, grounded in the quiet authority of their own presence. They felt a calm joy, soft and enduring, in knowing that their strength did not depend on the eyes of others, that their power lived quietly inside, and that it could withstand any misunderstanding, any insult, any harshness without faltering. In that gentle awareness, they finally understood the gift of restraint. It was not a limitation, not a surrender, not a compromise. It was a quiet triumph. And as they moved through the world, unseen but fully present, they carried it softly, steadily, like a lantern that needed no one else to light it. The soft glow of their inner power warmed them, steadied them, and whispered a truth they had long forgotten. The deepest strength is the one that grows in silence, nurtured by patience and protected by the quiet respect we give ourselves. They walked slowly now, feeling the weight of the day ease from their shoulders, though the world around them continued in its restless rhythm. The voices, the hurried footsteps, the small frictions of others' hurried lives. It was all still there, but it touched them differently now. There was a space between themselves and the world, a quiet distance that was not lonely, but full of gentle presence. Have you ever felt a calm settle so deeply that it does not need explanation? A stillness that does not need applause. They thought of all the moments they had carried, the ache of being misunderstood, the temptation to react, the sharp stirrings of impatience that had pressed so often against their chest. And now, each of those moments seemed like stones laid carefully in a path, each one leading them here, to this soft, steady place within themselves. How strange, they reflected, that the trials we think weigh us down can become the very foundation of inner strength if only we allow them to settle quietly. In the hush of the afternoon, they noticed the small movements of the world with new clarity. A leaf drifting slowly from a branch, the curve of light along the stones, the distant hum of wind through the trees. Everything seemed to pause just enough to be seen fully, not hurried, not forced, but simply there to be observed. And in watching, they felt a gentle joy, not a triumphant joy, but the kind that fills the chest quietly, a warmth that does not need recognition. They remembered the days when they had carried tension, when the world's misunderstandings had pressed upon them, when every moment had seemed too heavy to bear, and now they felt the contrast, a lightness that comes not from escaping the world, but from moving through it with quiet attention and self-respect. They had learned that silence is not emptiness, that stillness is not surrender, that holding oneself softly yet firmly can be a profound act of care for the soul. There was a rhythm to air steps, slow and steady, echoing the rhythm of their own heartbeat. Each breath reminded them that life could be lived without constant agitation, that presence could be enough, that noticing without demanding could change the way one moves through the world. And they realized that this calm was not fragile. It had grown strong through patient watching, through careful restraint, through the gentle tending of their own inner life. They thought of how often the world measures strength by noise and movement, by the quickness of reaction, by the visible claim to power. And yet here, in this quiet, they understood something else, that the truest strength is not always seen, that it lives in the patient, steady heartbeat, in the soft decision to remain whole, in the gentle persistence of self-respect. It does not demand attention, it does not seek approval, it simply exists, and in existing it shapes everything it touches. The light shifted slowly, and the shadows stretched across the ground, soft and long. In the gentle fading of the day, they felt a completion that was not an ending, but a quiet fullness. The lessons of patience, of silence, of measured restraint, they felt them settled now, not as rules or burdens, but as part of the soft architecture of their own being. And they realized that life does not need to be loud to be meaningful, that the heart can carry depth quietly, and that the soul can be rich and whole without anyone else noticing. And in that soft understanding, they felt a peace that did not rise or fall, but simply rested there, steady and unshakable. It was a quiet strength, a gentle assurance that they could move through the world without losing themselves, that they could meet misunderstanding with patience, impatience with calm, and the small cruelties of life with quiet dignity. And in that space, they felt themselves entirely present, entirely whole, and entirely alive. They walked on carrying the stillness like a soft cloak, not for display, not for recognition, but because it was part of them now, inseparable and enduring. The world continued as it always does, but they moved differently, lightly, carefully, with a quiet power that had been born from years of watching, waiting, and understanding. And in that quiet power, they felt the gentle truth of everything they had learned, that calm, patience, and self-respect are the companions that guide the heart home, softly, steadily, and entirely.